Okay, I think we're going to start rolling here. Welcome everybody to Building a Test Automation Framework. Okay, my name is Brett Haase. I'm a test automation architect with Utopia Solutions, and I work with a lot of different people, and I've been doing it for a while as well. My kids tell me I make great omelets and French toast. I don't know what else I can tell about myself. I am, I moonlight building award-winning STEM toys and games in VR and AR. So that's who I am. Hemant, go ahead.
Hey guys, this is Hemant Ojha. I work as a senior test automation engineer. I have around 10 years of experience in this industry, and a kind of a adventure sport lover and an occasional side diver. But I also find my interest in the QE industry as well. So let's begin.
Skydiving, you're insane. Just means you're insane. Okay.
So Brett, what do you think we are going to cover in this webinar?
I think it's probably better to start talking about what this webinar is not about. It's not a webinar about test automation, why you should automate, what you should automate, or exactly how to automate tests. What it is a webinar to share our stories and experiences about building test automation frameworks, because we've built many and they've been learning experiences, a lot of them.
You mean some of them are mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. We've made mistakes along the way while, building a lot of different test automation frameworks and different conditions and with different tools, in this dynamic changing industry. And that does amount to a lot of lessons that I think we're going to try to share here today.
Yeah, and so this webinar will walk you through some of the things we have learned building test automation frameworks and help you to think about some of the questions you will need to answer while building one for yourself. At the end, you will also have an access to a simple test automation framework that we built and made available to use publicly on GitHub. Right.
Okay. So, Hemant, what do you think a test automation framework should look like?
Good question, Brett. I believe a test automation framework is more about how teams want to collaborate and how it can help the team back. The framework we are going to discuss about today has an architecture that adheres to the requirements of the DevOps world and shift left approach, which is the current industry trend. We are into an era where developers seek faster feedback from tests, as fast as a unit test suite, which takes hardly a minute or two. Also, teams are now responsible for quality, the whole team, not an individual QA or an isolated QA team. Hence, there is a requirement of developer-friendly, fast, and low-maintenance framework. A framework that enables us to accommodate new versions of its components, such as new versions of browsers, new versions of the existing libraries, or any new library which can help you to enhance your framework. So, Brett, do you know what it should be composed of?
It should be composed of components. But yeah, from my experiences, our experiences certainly, there are kind of like must-haves that the framework, and again, I want to stress one size doesn't fit all. We're sharing our experiences here, but there's things that I think of as must-have components, which are, a test engine, reporting, API testing clients, a browser driver, and, maybe a wrapper for the browser driver, dependency management tool. And we're going to go into all of these in the webinar. But there's also other components I think that, maybe aren't required, but are kind of nice to have. Sometimes it's nice to have better logging and have logging components that support that. Browser hosting platform, you might, have BDD approach in your organizations, BDD tools, data management, and all of these components, when you kind of put them together describe the core of the framework. That is to say, that these components, when they're made up into a functional framework, they form the core framework functionalities that tests can be built upon, but they themselves are not the tests that are included in the framework.
Right. And when we talk about architecture, architecturally, I would say it's a good idea sometimes to separate your core framework, the main engine of your framework, from the test itself, because it just makes distribution of your framework core into multiple implementations of the test framework pretty much easier. So,
yeah, and I think we're gonna share a little about that.
Yep.
Further on.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So from an architectural perspective, an important question arises. That is, in what form do I want to write the tests? The choices, there are plenty of choices in the market right now. You choose a keyword-driven approach. You can use some scriptless framework such as Catalan or Selenium IDE, or you can choose to write your tests in coding, programming language also. Right, Brett?
Yeah, and I think, in my opinion, and I think where we are today in the industry, a lot of times, writing your tests in code gives you more strength, control, and it's generally more robust. If you're building a code-based framework, deciding which language to build it in is kind of the fundamental question. But choosing which one, it has a lot of factors, and it's not necessarily straightforward. And sometimes there isn't a right answer per se.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I agree with that. It has a lot more to do with your team and their preferences and the type of application you intend to automate the tests for. When we talk about language, I always thanks to Selenium because it gives us the flexibility to choose our desired programming language via their provided WebDriver clients. But it's really important to make this decision before you even start building the framework. And maybe I can share a story with you to illustrate this. I remember I was in a project where we started to build a framework on PHP. But later we had to migrate to Java framework because the developers preferred Java because their monolith, their main application was built in Hibernate framework of Java. So, and also they know that, actually we know that PHP WebDriver client, or to be specific, Facebook PHP WebDriver does not support W3C protocols yet. So that means we won't be able to use the latest Selenium server. Here, I'm not trying to unsell PHP WebDriver. I'm not saying it is bad or something. I'm just saying that it was not suitable for my project, the project we were working on. Right.
So it kind of gets to the questions that any team should be asking themselves about, which language to choose. It has more to do with, what are they comfortable with and what are they currently using to code their, as code in their repos.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also you need to consider that what is supported in the industry. Okay, for example, we're going to talk about a number of components over here that we chose to use into our framework, and the public repos have good number of contributors, which ensures that someone will be there to address your queries. Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Next slide.
So I'd say once your team has made a decision on which programming language you want to build your framework on, now you need to think about the components of the framework. And this starts with the test engine.
And I think by that, you mean the unit testing framework. Am I right, Hemant?
Yeah, more or less, you're right, exactly.
Because I think most people are thinking in terms of like JUnit or NUnit, or like you mentioned, PHP unit. And just to get the nomenclature right, so unit testing framework and test engine are kind of synonymous. So, and what they do is they're going to help you as a component of your framework. They're going to help you manage a whole bunch of tests. It gives your framework scalability. basically, when you have more and more tests, it should be able to handle them. It's going to enable you to write your tests in code. Technically speaking, you can convert a method of class into a test. It's going to help you manage the things that happen before and after a test executes, like pre and post test actions, like maybe logging starts and ends or data setup. It's going to help you group and categorize and run specific tests.
Yeah, or you can also execute all of your tests if required, or you run some groups of tests from any environment you prefer, such as from an IDE or from a CLI or from a continuous integration environment, right?
Yeah. And usually they also have some simple reporting or logging helpers, so they can generate execution reports and logs. And am I missing anything else, Hemant?
Yeah, I think those test engines also provide you the capability of parallelizing your test or execute them in parallel.
Okay. So it's important. It does a lot of kind of what we talked about now, but the attendees of the webinar are going to be thinking in terms of, how do I make a determination? What test engine should I utilize? And Hemant, what do you think about that?
I mean, there are a lot of factors on which it depends upon. First one, I would say, is the language you are developing your framework in. And the second one is what does your developer know and already using? So these two are the major factors here. Okay.
So language and what you mean unit testing frameworks are my developers currently using?
Yes. And okay. And for the framework which we're gonna share with you today, we are using TestNG because we find it feature rich. And also one of the reasons for using TestNG is that since this framework is going to be in Java, and when you choose Java as a language, there are two options available. I would say three, but I'll talk about two of them. The first one is TestNG, and the second is JUnit. And we think that, and we have experienced that TestNG has all the features, all the benefits of JUnit, and also eliminates most of the limitations of the other framework.
Thanks, Hemant. So if your test automation framework is going to drive tests by the UI, you're going to need a means to interact with it. And there's different options out there, Cypress and other things. But, certainly the most well-known is Selenium. And for the purpose of the webinar here, the framework we're going to share is using Selenium. So, but I think one maybe common misconception, and, maybe it's not so common as I think, but common misconception is that Selenium is an automated test tool in itself, but in reality, it's not. It's just an API that automates the browser. That's all it is. So it doesn't have all of the features of a commercial test tool that you may have used in the past, insertions, reportings, or configurations, or some features. So there's definitely some limitations that require either finding the right libraries or maybe a wrapper around Selenium, or building that functionality yourself.
Yeah, in my experience, I'd say building everything by yourself kind of a old school thing. But to expedite the framework creation process, wrappers can be really helpful, such as Selenide for a Java framework, or Water or Capybara if you are interested in developing framework in Ruby. In the case of the framework, in the case of this framework, we'll share with you, we have used a wrapper around Selenium known as Selenide, which builds on Selenium to implement much of the core of the framework.
Yeah, and we like Selenide, so maybe I'll explain a little bit more about what it does. It's a concise, fluent API. It provides AJAX support. Gives you stability for tests. It's got powerful selectors, pretty simple configuration. It handles start and shut down of browsers or timeouts, stale elements, exceptions. It kind of handles a lot of things that let you focus on writing your tests, the business logic for the tests, and handles a lot of what the core should handle. So it's useful. But I do want to, I'm not taking issue with the old-fashioned approach that comment you made, Hemant, but a wrapper, like Selenide or a tool like that, although it's useful, it's not necessarily a magic bullet. So, in the same way, Selenium is not a testing tool. So sometimes, and I think in our case, we did a lot of building right on top of Selenium before we started using wrappers like Selenide. And I think that actually did a lot of good for us. So, it's sort of the school of hard knocks. So I think that was just good experience. So I'm not saying don't go using Selenium and building on it. But sometimes, to expedite things, you've got tools out there, libraries that can help you. All right. So if your framework is going to interact with the API, which it very likely will, you're going to need an API testing support. And, we make some assumptions here. So, we make some assumptions about this webinar that the folks coming into the webinar have general knowledge of APIs and API testing. But I think an area that's important to address is from an automation perspective, why is it important to include API testing support in a framework that has UI interaction support? And I think the best way to say this is we've learned over the years that, if you just build at the UI framework level, it kind of leads you down this path of doing all your testing through the UI, which is the slowest and most unreliable way to automate. And there's a lot of things that are common between both API and UI level testing, passing data, reporting, logging, maybe assertions. And so I guess building two different frameworks and maintaining two, when a lot of the things you do in UI and API are going to be the same, is maybe a maintenance headache. So you don't necessarily want to go that way. It's good to maybe include both in the same framework.
Yeah, and so thanks for the explanation, Brett. And another reason I would like to mention here is the shift left industry trend, where we try to get our tests to be as close as to the code as possible. So also we can use those APIs to quickly set up or tear down the tests or test data to make the tests more robust, more independent, and faster. So I like to mention here that almost all the modern applications which you are using in your mobile application are based on APIs. These applications open their APIs endpoints to let third party to use the services over the internet securely. I would like to give an example here. Let's say you are using Uber, and in Uber you are using your Google Maps. You can see your car running on the Uber, on the Google Maps over there on the application. Now, what do you think? Do you think that Uber has created its own version of Google Maps? No, they are using Google Maps APIs and customizing it for their own use, right? So it's necessary to make sure that they are working as expected, because people and their businesses are dependent on them. Just imagine a bad API when you send for takeaway pizza. Isn't it funny? All right.
Pizza goes right. Yeah.
Although there are many tools for API testing out there, but I would really like to focus on the code-based API clients, such as Rest Assured and Karate, and sometimes I also use Postman for ad hoc API testing. Talking more about API clients, they allow you to test your API in many ways without changing your coding environment. And it also encourages developers to contribute to the test suite because they don't need to learn any other tool. They don't need to switch to any other tool. Okay. And talking more about Rest Assured, which I like the most, it's a client which supports all the actions of your REST API, such as post, put, get, delete, name anything. And it also gives you the capability of contract testing as well, which is quite important when you use third-party applications.
Okay, for this next slide, I have to practice my my radio voice. One of the benefits of your shiny new test automation framework should be clear and understandable, if not really spiffy test results.
Oh, so Brett, what do you mean by spiffy?
And yeah, I know you're not familiar with those terms, Hemant, but by spiffy, I mean really great looking, reports, results, which in all seriousness and joking aside, it's not the end goal. Although it's nice to have nice looking reporting, the end goal is fast, accurate, but factual, actionable feedback. And there's a lot of reporting libraries out there that you can include in your framework. And many of them are also really, really spiffy too. So if you'll excuse me, embarrassing myself here, that voice. Examples would be like extent reports. We've got some up here, Allure reports, Report NG, Report Portal. And there's a lot of different features for those reporting libraries, right, Hemant?
Yeah, exactly. The features can be really helpful for to make your framework more useful, I would say, if you use those reports in their full capacity. Some of the features I can list over here are consolidation of artifacts related to each test, such as screenshots, attachments, logging attachments. If you use them properly, then you can see the historical data to generate the test performance trends. They also provide very nice graphs and smart categorization by severity and priority of your application issues. Many of them provide the feature of filtering and sorting test results. So if you want to search through a large number of tests, you can easily do that. And you can also find out which tests are taking shorter time and which are longer, so that you can improve your tests and make them to execute in the short time possible.
That's really nifty, Hemant. So are there any considerations? Nifty is another word, like libraries, maybe dependencies on programming languages with there are dependencies with any of these reporting libraries that would.
Yeah, I would say I would say yes. There are some of the reports are really I would say specifically dependent, and some are general. So let's talk about extend report. This is particularly made in Java, and it is best suited for a Java framework, right? And there are other reports as well, such as Allure and report portal.io, and they have their own clients written in different language. So you can use Allure and report portal.io for other programming languages as well. So for example, we are currently using Allure in a PHP unit framework. In the same way, you can also use report portal.io. But also want to tell you that there are basically two kinds of reports. First is the static report, which gets generated after every build. But there are also server-based reports, and those reports are good because they help you to find the trends in your test execution. Okay, right.
Yep. And we're, for the framework we're sharing today, we're using extent reports. So because we know it well.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
we are using it.
So we've covered, some of the major components of the framework, and now we have to think about how we assemble them and keep them together. And that's where build management comes together, or build management comes in. So, build management or build automation helps us to automate the creation of, applications from the source code. And it's going to, perform a lot of the tasks that a developer would do, kind of in their day-to-day activities, like, downloading a dependencies or compiling source code into binary, packing that code, running, generating reports, maybe deployment activities. And, since we intend to deploy the framework in multiple projects, then a build management tool is kind of a required feature to maintain the framework core.
Right. And in this case of the framework, which we're going to share today, we are using Apache Maven for build management as a build tool. And this is a well-known and often utilized tool with the Selenium test automation frameworks.
Yep. Thanks,
right.
Hemant. And one thing I do want to bring up is we're sharing our ideas here and some of our experiences and thoughts, but there's, what we're not doing is we're not trying to kind of, I guess, pigeonhole is maybe the right word. We're not trying to pigeonhole or give you a template to say, copy what we did. Your team is going to be different than the team we have and the teams we've worked with. And one thing I can say is it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, there are strong consistencies, but there may be components out there that your team or languages your team works in that aren't things that our team would necessarily work in or that we didn't talk about today, but you're familiar with it, you're comfortable with it, and it works for you, then definitely take that path. And another thought behind this is it's a changing industry. There's new stuff coming out all the time. So staying aware of that, keeping in front of that is really important. So I just wanted to say we're trying to give you a guideline and share some wisdom, but we're not trying to tell you to do things exactly a certain way.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts, Brett. And one last thing, which can make your framework more acceptable, is its design to mix with the existing continuous integration and continuous delivery tool of your company. And to be in that tool chain, it's also not necessary to keep your test framework in the same project. Okay, but there are advantages to keep them into the same project. So think about that as well. Because ultimately you have to work on that. All right.
Whoops, sorry.
No worries. Let's move to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay. Now we're gonna give you a high-level look at the sample framework, which we're gonna provide you at the end of this webinar. And
okay. Here we are.
All right. Yes.
I'll tackle this one maybe for a minute. So,
yeah, sure.
As we shared before, there's 2 projects in GitHub that are associated with the webinar, and we made both of them public. One is the framework core, which you see on the left, and that's, the other is a sample application project that includes sample tests that you should be able to use. So you should be able to set up the core and the sample project. And the framework core is a dependency to the sample application project. And, the code structure is pretty, I think, self-documenting, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and one of the advantage of using a framework core as a dependency is that it's pretty clear that we can use it into multiple projects. But as long as if all of your projects are in the same programming language. So, but if you have a different project, if you have a project in different programming language, then you can use the combination of framework core and sample application independently as well to test that application. Right. Okay, let's move to the next slide and talk about how in the ways of writing your tests. We can have plenty of styles of writing a test, but we would like to share about 2 different approaches here. First one is the fluent approach, and the second one is the classic way. In the first one, I really like this approach, but because it makes your test easier to read and understand. It's just like using a PDD tool, but in the coding format. But it has its own limitations, such as it doesn't fit when you are not sure about the next steps, like that. The another approach is the classic way, where you create the reference object of the pages and call the required function. And in classic way also, you can make your test pretty readable if you name your functions very well, if you name your variables very well, and if you use your logs, you can still make the classic way test more readable. But in both the cases, we are using, and we recommend to use page object model, because that actually makes the test maintenance pretty easier in the case of application changes. Okay, and after that, yeah.
And again, I was going to say, this is maybe a little outside of the, structuring the test automation framework, but it's helpful because you're going to be writing tests when you put a framework together. So
that's right.
So and we have results.
Okay. All right. Moving on to the next slide is
I know that's soon.
Yeah.
Those are
okay.
bad too. Those bad. Go ahead.
No worries. But I'm sure our audience will make it pass. Okay. So this is a screenshot from the report we generated post the execution from our framework, pulling extent reports library to the framework core, and with a little bit of Java knowledge, we could easily integrate it into our framework. And it gives you enough details of test execution to carry on with the test failures analysis. And also it's highly customizable. It makes our life easier during the test failure analysis. And in the same way, you can also think of replacing it with other reports such as Allure or reportportal.io. As I said, it completely depends upon your project and your preferences. Okay.
Okay. So I think, we've talked a little bit and we've gone, I think, a little bit over, but we can probably answer a couple of questions. And I am going to have a look. So Hemant, we do have a question. I'll just ask this one. What are alternatives to Selenium?
Selenium that's an excellent question, because nowadays if you browse internet and type test automation, everybody can see the Selenium everywhere. But it's not the fact. There are other tools too, or there are other wrappers as well. So I'll say there are tools such as Robot Framework or Cypress.io. They are good, strong alternatives of Selenium. And if you're thinking of building a framework in different language such as Ruby, then you can prefer Capybara. And if you are thinking of writing your test in, let's say, JavaScript, you can think of Protector as well, which is good for AngularJS. Yeah.
And there's probably a lot of folks in the audience that are aware of things that we may not be. So
exactly.
we don't know it all. We're just talking today. Another question that looks pretty good is, I can maybe answer this, Hemant, is it really necessary to split the core from the tests? Is it necessary? Well, no, you don't have to do that, I guess. And Hemant, I'll give my brief answer. If you want to add anything, you can. But how I would answer this is, if you think about it, a lot of what you're doing when you're building a framework is common, and it's used all the time, and it's something that doesn't necessarily change often. So you might, logging or reporting or data management, different functions that you use are used all over the place. And you may, in the case of our life, is we sometimes take a toolbox with us, and it's good to have a framework core that you can implement somewhere, but and then make enhancements, changes to, and then push those enhancements and changes into all of the instances where you're using that framework. So it gives you some, I guess, portability, and prevents undue maintenance. But I'm not saying that it is necessarily the right approach. You may have a big monolithic application, and your framework sits just fine. It's working with that application, and you wouldn't necessarily have needed the approach that we're suggesting here. But it's just something that we've learned where we are. And Hemant, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I think
have really any time.
You covered almost all the things, so we're good.
And I think there are I think some other questions. We can certainly field those questions by email, and get back responses to you all. But definitely appreciate connecting with everybody here on this webinar. Thanks for attending, and on behalf of Utopia Solutions, have a wonderful day, and we'll definitely get back to those questions.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.